Hello guys, welcome to my shop. This is an introduction video on a series of videos that I'm going to be putting together on chassis setup and suspension setup. I'll be focusing on the YZ250 two-stroke, mainly from 2006 to 2021. However, most of this stuff can also be applied to four-strokes and other makes and models. So, you know, if you don't have a YZ250, let's say you have a YZ125, it's not a big deal. This stuff works on pretty much any bike out there. But if you do have a YZ250, then you're going to be in luck, because I'm also going to be giving you what I consider some of my secret formulas on these bikes. So first off, suspension is something that people can argue about till the cows come home. It's just one of them things, you know, everyone has a different way of doing it. Some people know what they're talking about, some people don't. Just like they say, there's two types of suspension tuners out there and suspension shops. There's one that just says, your bike's all wrong, bring me your suspension and we'll get it right. And there's the other shop out there that says, go out there and see how good you can get it on your own and then come back with your complaints and we'll work on that. So as you can see, this stuff goes all over the place. For me, I started really geeking out on suspension and chassis setup probably about a year after I started riding. I just noticed that a lot of people were faster than me and had a better form and just looked better riding than I did, and I thought I could never be like that. But I've kind of always been a tinkerer, and you know, a type of guy who likes to turn wrenches and figure out how things work and how to make things better and modify things. So I started really focusing on suspension, and I found that if I had the bike set up better for me, it allowed me to actually trust the bike and allowed me to learn and go faster. And with this, I actually believe I became a pretty decent rider, so it's not too bad. I've gained a lot of knowledge on suspension and tuning, and I'm hoping to share this stuff with you today. Now, like I said, there's going to be people that disagree, and hey, maybe you know more than I do. That's okay. Then maybe this video is not for you, but maybe I can help you out with stuff if you don't know as much. I will definitely be able to help you out with the YZ250, so let's get started. Well, actually, I'm jumping the gun a little bit. Let me give you a breakdown how this is going to work. This first video, we're just going to focus on getting the bike ready to be set up. The next video, I'm going to focus on things like the sag and the fork height setting, get the pitch of the bike where we want it, and then we'll go from there. The next video might be, let's say, only the rear shock or just the forks. So we're going to break it down into pieces, because that way we can really talk about what each setting does and how it affects the bike, and what to look for as you're making changes. And then somewhere towards the last video, I'm going to try my best to hopefully help show you how to put it all together as a package so you can get your bike really set up and good for you. So the first thing is, make sure you have a good bike. It's set up good, as far as like you have a bottoming out bumper on your shock in there that's not worn away. The shock is not leaking. It's full of nitrogen. It's been serviced somewhat recently, so the oil is still good and has good dampening. Make sure you don't have any fork leaks or anything like that. And again, make sure they've been serviced somewhat recently, so you know you have good fluid in there, and you know, so you won't be doing all this work for just no reason. Another thing you want to pay attention to is on the front forks. A lot of people get this wrong. On the right side of the bike here, when you go to, before you tighten these up, you want to loosen them up and slide this on the axle as far out as you can, and slide it as far in as you can, and see how far you can slide it, and then find the middle point, and that's going to be the magic spot. Because if you don't do that, as the forks go to compress, they start, this is pinched in, so it starts to bind. As it's coming up, it starts to bind onto the fork bushings, and it'll cause a whole bunch of friction. It does end up eating up your fork bushings and seals and everything like that. So on these YZs, it's usually, on this one, you can see the axle is just a little bit in, and that seems to be a sweet spot for this one. But I remember, like back in 06, it was like perfectly flush. But everyone's different, so just make sure you check yours and make sure you have that right. And, you know, make sure your triple clam bolts here are nice and snug. Make sure your steering, how I like to set mine up is so that there's a little bit of friction. It'll eventually fall on its own when it's on the stand. Maybe as I get closer to the end here. Actually right now hardly not, but I go by how much friction. I've been doing this for a long time. I just feel the friction. There should just be a little bit of friction. So you want to tighten up your steering bearings course, you want good bearings, so it'd be nice and smooth, but you want to tighten them up where there's just an ever so slight amount of friction. You can see as I bump it here. There, you know, just a little bit of friction. The most important thing about that is when you have friction, you definitely know that the bearings are tightened up so there's no play at all. When you have them set up where they're nice and loose, the truth is you don't know if there's really any play. I mean, you can grab the front wheel over here and feel it, but you don't really know for certain. But when it's perfect, when there is friction, you can be rest assured that there's going to be no play in the bearings. And you definitely don't want them loose enough where there's a little bit of play, because that gets seriously amplified at the wheel here, and it'll just make the bike feel nervous. Some people say it's a poor man's stabilizer when you tighten this up because the bike feels more stable. I don't think it has anything to do with the drag on the steering that makes them more stable. I believe it's just because this does not wiggle any once you have a little bit of friction. It guarantees that the bearings are actually snug enough, and I believe that's why the bike is more stable. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is just grab the rear wheel while the bike's on the stand. Pick up and down on it, see if there's any play. If you're finding any play in the linkage, you're going to want to address that before we get started. Now I will say on these YZ250s, if you find a small, I'm talking about the smallest amount of up and down at the rear wheel, go ahead and have someone pull up and down on the rear wheel while you feel around and see where that play is at. If it is the upper shock bearing in here, you don't really have to worry about that then. If it's just that one, you're okay. That's a symmetrical bearing. It's a round one, Teflon coated. They kind of get a little bit of play right after break-in, but they just stay right there. So if you have that tiny little bit of play up there, don't worry about it. You're going to be okay. However, if there's any play anywhere else, you're going to want to address that before you really start trying to dial in your suspension. Make sure everything's smooth. Make sure there's no play. And if you do have to replace any bearings on the rear linkage or anything like that, when you're reassembling it, everything, you want to keep all the bolts on everything loose, even the swing arm pivot. If you have to take the swing arm off, leave them loose. Set the bike on the ground, hop on it a few times first, and then tighten everything up, because there's always a little bit of play in them until you get them all the way tightened up. And you want that play to be on the compressed end so that you can always duplicate the same, you know, if you ever had to. Because once you get your bike set up the way you like it, if you're like me, you get OCD about it. Once it's good, you don't want anything to change. So you want to be able to always put it right back to how it was. And by tightening everything up while the wheels are on the ground, after weighting the bike, jumping up and down on it a few times, that will help ensure that you always end up with the everything in the same parameters. And most people know all these settings, but I'm gonna run through it. These are all the things we're gonna run through. The rear sag, that's how far the back end sags when you sit on the bike. That is adjusted over here. There's little spanners on the rear shock. Then you have the shock's low speed compression, that's the flat head in here. You have the high speed compression, that's the 17mm hex right there. The rebound is down here on the bottom of the shock, the flat head right in there, that's for the rebound on the shock. So we're going to be focusing on all that. Then on the forks, you have the fork height. That's measured. Here you go. I like to measure it with a set of calipers. And you want to measure it. Oh, this thing. Let me get it to focus. Let's see here. There we go. I like to measure it with a set of calipers. You want to measure it to the top of the tube. Let me get this set up better. Okay, you want to set it from the top of the tube right here, not the cap. You want to measure from the top of the tube to the top of the triple clamp. So it's going to be like that. And as you can see, I got mine at about 7mm currently. But that's where we're going to be taking our measurements when we get to that part of this. Then on the forks compression on these bikes is up top here, the flathead, and the rebound is under the forks. Right there, there's a flathead in there. It's dirty, but it's in there. And the last setting that we will be talking about is the fork oil height inside the forks. The higher you have the fork oil, the more it resists bottoming. The lower you have it, the less it'll resist bottoming. It mainly affects, as they say, your last 1/3 of the travel, and that's about right. Springs. In my opinion, most people don't need to pay a lot of money to have their bike revalved. The suspension is so good nowadays. Really what it needs, in my opinion, is to be sprung properly for your weight, and then have all the suspension settings and chassis set up for you, and that pretty much does it. These bikes come so good now that you know, to have them revalved, it's, you know, a little sketchy sometimes too, because I've had people bring me suspension components that have been revalved to be serviced. I take them apart and find that stuff came loose, like they didn't use Loctite on the nut that holds the shim stack on, or they didn't stake the nut that holds the shim stack on, and things like that. I've definitely found some pretty shady stuff inside suspension after they've been revalved. I'm not trying to talk trash about suspension guys. I'm being honest the best I can. And a lot of these suspension guys that I've talked to and met, some of them I should say, aren't even really that good of a mechanic, and yet this is what they're doing for a living. Again, I'm not trying to talk bad about them. I'm just giving you my opinion and trying to help you out. In my opinion, stock suspension is good, obviously up to a certain level, but even then, as long as it's set up properly for you. And that's what we're looking to do in these videos, is help you set it up properly for you. So let's talk about spring rates. The YZ250 stock, it comes with very light springs. If you're very light, you might be okay with them. The rear is a 4.9 and the front, I believe, is a .43 or 44. I think it's a 44 now, but somewhere in that range. And it's really light. I would say you're going to have to be about 130 pounds for them springs to be okay for you. I weigh about 150. I'm running a 5.3 in the back and .47 up front currently. Whatever springs you have, when you change springs, it has very little effect on the dampening, on the chassis setup and dampening. So like, if I set this bike up with a 4-point stock springs, 4.9 in the rear and .47 in the front, and then I went and put these, what I currently have on it, the 5.3 in the back of the .47 up in the front. If I basically went from stock springs to these springs with these same settings, I won't have to make many changes to the settings because I changed the springs. The springs don't really affect the settings a whole lot. If they do affect the settings, it's only going to be in the rebound area usually, because the spring is going to be pushing the bike back up quicker, and you might have to add one more click of rebound, front or rear or both, but that's only sometimes, and you'll kind of know right away. But if you got your compression clickers and your rebound clickers and everything set perfectly, and you change spring rates, usually you won't have to change much in the clickers. It'll usually they'll just fall right into what you're looking for them to do, which is to hold the bike up a little bit better. That's really what you're looking for in springs. When you go to stiffer springs, it's not so much to control bottoming, although it does help, but that's not its main purpose. Its main purpose is to hold the bike up better, especially as you start getting faster. You'll when you get on the throttle, if the springs are too light, the back end will sink too much, and when you get on the brakes, the front end will dive too much. So by going to the proper springs for your weight, you're going to keep the bike a little more level. When you get on the throttle, it's not going to lean back as much, and when you get heavy on the brakes, it's not going to dive as much. It'll also allow you to hit the obstacles quicker and faster, because the bike's going to get back up into its proper riding stance faster. After hitting each obstacle, it's going to get back up to that quicker. So it will allow you to go faster if you have the correct spring rates for your weight. But if you don't, it's okay. You can still set the bike up the best you can with the springs you have, and you can worry about the springs later. But definitely, if you've never done springs before, it's really nice when you get a bike sprung for your weight. You really can feel it, and it's really not that hard to do. I have a video, if you go through my videos, that show you how to change the springs on a shock and a fork. Check them out, and it's pretty easy to do. So that's it, guys, for the short introduction. Make sure you click subscribe and like the video if you can, help me get it out there. But definitely click click subscribe if you're going to be curious or interested in this stuff, because I'll be posting about a video a week, maybe a video every 2 weeks tops, until I get this whole series done on the suspension and chassis setup. And so yeah, stay tuned, because we're going to be running through it. And also in the comment section, give me some ideas too of what you might be struggling with the suspension, with your suspension setup, so I can hopefully address these things as I go along in this series. Again, this short series, but I mean, it's a short video. This is just the introduction. Next video, we're going to get down and dirty. So I'll see you in the next video. Take it easy. Oh, by the way, it's Christmas. Merry Christmas, guys. See ya.